PLB Professional Languages Brazil podcasts. PLB Languages on Demand. Join us and give your English an upgrade. Visit our website www.plbnet.com.br or call us on 5586 4141 2527.
Hello, I'm Jill McGivering. Welcome to The World This Week, the programme that tells you how the world has changed in the past 7 days. This was the week when a chemical weapons attack erupted into the worst crisis for decades between Britain and Russia.
We will not tolerate the threat to life of British people and others on British soil from the Russian government, nor will we tolerate such a flagrant breach of Russia's international obligations.
The week when President Trump changed the hand guiding the country's foreign tiller.
Rex and I have been talking about this for a long time. We got along actually quite well, but we disagreed on things.
When the Kurds suffered dramatic setbacks in Syria and Iraq. Also in this programme, the Sunshine Policy, which is actually a challenge to India's Asian super rival.
The Indians are very keen to have friends who are not necessarily inimical to China, but who are willing to present a common front.
The first use of a nerve agent in Europe since the Second World War. That was the stark assessment by Britain, the United States, Germany and France of the attack earlier in the month on a Russian former double agent and his daughter in the English city of Salisbury. As Sergei Skripal and his daughter Yulia clung somehow to life, and a third victim, a British policeman, seemed to make a slow recovery, Britain blamed Russia for the attack. Russia denied any involvement, but 23 of its diplomats were told to leave London, the toughest such action for decades. For many, the attack recalled the killing of Alexander Litvinenko. He was a former KGB officer, poisoned with radioactive polonium in London in 2006. Russia denied involvement in that too. I asked our diplomatic correspondent Jonathan Marcus why was the British government so certain that Russia was behind the latest attack.
Whatever evidence the British government says it has, and that rests upon their analysis of samples of the material, a belief that this is a highly toxic nerve agent of military grade that they say was made by the former Soviet Union. The other pillar of their argument is the context, the threats that have been made on the record by the Russian government against traitors and defectors, and the fact, of course, that the British believe that the Russian state has done something similar once before in Britain. Now, that is the case for the prosecution, if you like. They have put that case to allied governments, and pretty well all of those governments have come out with a resounding yes, we concur with the idea that the Russian state was in all likelihood behind this.
One of the Russian complaints is that they haven't been allowed to have access to the nerve agent that was used. Wouldn't it have been reasonable that they could?
I think what you do need is an independent body to look at the samples and to give their assessment of them. And of course, that is precisely what is going to happen. There is this organisation, the OPCW, the Organisation for the Prevention of Chemical Weapons. Now, they are going to be given samples by the British government, and they will be able to carry out their own analysis. The crucial point here, I think, is that not only is the British case that the Russians have actually used this nerve agent on the streets of a British city, but that actually they used it, they possessed it at a time when they should have given up all their chemical weapons. Russia abandoned all of its chemical weapons. It was apparently approved, signed off by this OPCW organisation, and the British contention is that in fact Russia retained some chemical weapons after that date and has used a small sample of them in this attack.
So the British government clearly determined to take tough action. We've seen 23 diplomats expelled, that announcement. What else might the UK have done that might really hurt Russia?
Diplomatically, a strong response with these expulsions. A significant proportion of Russia's diplomatic mission in Britain is being expelled. Of course, it is rather interesting that Britain says that these are all undeclared intelligence officers. The other aspect, of course, is the financial measures, and there, of course, there's been a lot of criticism, a suggestion that the financial measures that have been taken so far are not as resolute as they might appear. But having said all of that, I think the crucial thing is that what Britain alone does is not going to count for much. The crucial thing is what is done in connection with its allies and everybody else. And I think there we're still at the early stages. Step one, I think, is to get everybody on side with the British narrative.
And we seem to be hearing that, don't we? We've had that
been
expression
hearing that.
of support.
I think that is, over the last few days, we've seen a very, very strong response rhetorically, with sympathy, with support from allied governments. It's interesting how strong the American position has been. This is probably the strongest criticism of Russia that we've seen since Mr. Trump came to office. The problem now, of course, is to turn that into action. And, of course, what we're being told by officials is that this attack in Salisbury shouldn't be seen in isolation. When I spoke to the NATO Secretary-General a day or so ago, he was effectively saying, look, there is a whole pattern of Russian activity, from the shooting down of the airliner over Ukraine, to interference in elections, to threats against the Baltic republics, to this particular action on British soil, and many, many more instances. And in a sense, what you have to do is see the West's approach to Russia in the round, and that sanctions are not only going to be part of the deal in terms of this particular attack, but obviously there are a lot of existing sanctions already against Russia. As one British official told me, the dial is already set at quite a high level. And of course, the discussions in the coming days and weeks will be how to turn up that dial somewhat more. I think it is difficult, though, because, as I say, there is already a high level of sanctions against Russia. One has to say as well that it hasn't changed Russia's behaviour. But I think the sense I get from all of the officials I've spoken to over the past week is that so far so good. They're very, very reassured by the strong support that the British government has got. Now they're moving on to try and turn that into practical steps.
You mentioned earlier, Jonathan, this, of course, isn't happening in isolation. It's partly against this pattern that you mentioned of a broader sense of Russian behaviour. Is there also, though, a broader sense of the UK testing the support it's getting, testing its alliances in the age of President Trump and, of course, of Brexit?
You're right to point out that there might well have been some uneasiness in Britain, a feeling with the Brexit debate, the disagreements with Britain's European partners, the arrival of Mr. Trump in the White House, who has a curious approach, shall we say, to President Putin, seems very reluctant on occasion to criticise him. I think there might well have been a concern in London as to what response they were likely to get from their friends. I think maybe the Russians too perhaps imagined that Britain was rather more isolated than it first appeared. In actual fact, British officials one speaks to clearly seem so far to be very reassured by the response that they have got.
Jonathan Marcus. There are many ways of firing someone: a discreet chat, a letter perhaps. Then again, if you're the President of the United States and you want to get rid of your Secretary of State, there's always a tweet. That's how Rex Tillerson heard this week that he was out of a job. Some called it brutal. Others were surprised by the timing. The issues of North Korea and Iran are both coming to the boil. Our State Department correspondent, Barbara Plett-Usher, has been getting to the bottom of the fog surrounding the State Department's headquarters in Foggy Bottom.
It was back in August last year when I first reported on rumours of a Rexit, that is, the exit of Rex Tillerson. And his relationship with President Trump got far more toxic after that. So I shouldn't have been surprised at his ultimate demise, but I was. He'd steadily dug in his heels in his no-nonsense Texas way, telling one advisor, "The president may fire me tomorrow, but I am not a quitter." And the president, for all his flamboyant firing of apprentices on reality TV, doesn't actually like to fire people in person. So in the end, he took to Twitter, without even talking to his Secretary of State. Whatever his faults, Tillerson did not deserve that. State Department officers didn't like the way their boss was treated, but they didn't much like their boss either. He turned out to be a terrible manager who triggered an exodus of experienced staff and gummed up the working of the building with his insular micromanaging team of aides. Good riddance was the reaction of one employee. "Maybe the mechanics of operating here will improve now," said another. "Maybe it will. Mike Pompeo seems to have done all right running the CIA. But he's also a foreign policy hawk with a reputation as a fierce ideologue and a history of ruthless partisanship. Many diplomats are wary." "What would you rather have?" a former State Department official asked me darkly during one of those many moments when we contemplated a Rexit. The incompetence and solid policies of a Tillerson, or the competence and dangerous policies of a Pompeo? The new Secretary of State will reveal his hand quickly with how he approaches two pressing national security issues, North Korea and Iran. Pompeo will take the helm as the White House has to decide whether to keep the Iran nuclear deal. President Trump has told European allies to toughen the agreement or he'll scrap it, and has given them until May to do so. Tillerson helped restrain Trump's urge to kill the deal and was negotiating with the Europeans for a way to save it. Pompeo, on the other hand, has been one of its strongest critics. It's not clear if his new responsibilities may temper his approach, but it was this issue that President Trump singled out as his area of greatest contention with Tillerson and of like-mindedness with Pompeo. It's safe to say the odds of Trump pulling the plug have increased. The president also brought Pompeo on board shortly after deciding to meet the North Korean leader, Kim Jong-un. White House officials said Trump wanted the CIA director at his side for potential negotiations to eliminate Kim's nuclear weapons. Mike Pompeo is thoroughly across the brief, but as the head of the CIA, not the Secretary of State crafting a complex diplomatic process. We know he is a deep skeptic that talks will be successful, that his rhetoric has been belligerent, that he's mused in public about removing Kim Jong-un, and that he's widely believed to be more open to military options than Tillerson was. His fans say he'll set the necessary red lines for negotiations, communicating clearly to Kim Jong-un that denuclearization is the only option and that should diplomacy fail, the U.S. will act. His detractors say he will increase the chances of a failed summit and possibly war. There's a virtual consensus amongst Washington's chattering classes that Tillerson was a bad Secretary of State, but he did serve as a check on some of Trump's most controversial impulses. Pompeo is a Trump loyalist who can be expected to amplify and enable those instincts. But crucially, he has the president's confidence, so he can speak with authority to foreign governments, something Rex Tillerson could not do. The question is whether greater harmony between Trump and his new Secretary of State will lead to more coordinated policy and a significant role for diplomacy. Trump has shown a contempt for diplomacy that went beyond his disdain for Tillerson, and he thrives on chaos. Pompeo may well be the test of whether it's possible to be a successful Secretary of State under this president.
Barbara Plett-Usher. You're listening to The World This Week, the programme that tells you what happened in the past 7 days and why it counts. And if you enjoy factual podcasts like ours, you might also be interested in trying Witness. History told by the people who were there, first-hand accounts of some of the most important events which have helped to shape our lives and the places we live. There are 5 podcasts a week and an incredible archive to delve into. Go to bbcworldservice.com/podcasts and search for Witness. Tens of thousands of people have left the Kurdish town of Afrin in northern Syria this week. They've been fleeing an advance on the town by Turkish forces trying to strangle any Kurdish state at birth. And the Kurds, once the darlings of the West, are no longer getting help from the United States. And it's not just in Afrin that Kurds are having a hard time. They've suffered political and military reverses in Iraq too. The government in Baghdad is reopening airports in the Kurdish north on its own terms after a blockade of almost 6 months. The BBC's Jim Muir has spent years tracking the fate of the Kurds. I asked him how far all these different developments are part of a common pattern.
The common factor, in a way, is that the Kurds, both in Syria and Iraq, have joined the West, specifically the Americans, in fighting IS. They have, to a certain extent, benefited from taking part in that struggle. But at the same time, I think on both sides now, both the Iraqi and Syrian Kurds, they feel that they've been sort of let down by their allies. Perhaps they expected more support to capitalize on the gains they've been able to make as a result of Western support in the fight against IS. So
is it reasonable for them to feel let down, do you think?
It's understandable, but I think if they were being realistic and hard-headed, they would realise that other nations, as they themselves do, pursue their own interests, and it would be fairly naive to think that they could expect them simply to stand by them through thick and thin as they try to pursue ambitions which go far beyond their battle against IS, the so-called Islamic State. I don't think many Kurds would regard the step taken in deciding a referendum last September in northern Iraq, for example, among the Kurds there, as being a smart thing to do, because in the
referendum on independence.
That's right, the independence referendum, which was seen as red rag to the bull of the Iraqi government, its Iranian and other supporters, the regional powers like Turkey, Iran, Syria and Iraq itself, which all have Kurdish populations and which are very much against the idea of Kurdish independence. So it was the wrong moment, and they paid a very high price for making that big blunder.
And the Kurds in northern Iraq, as you say, still paying the price. And we've seen just this week the opening of the airports to international traffic again, very much on the terms of the Iraqi government.
Well, yes. I mean, if you consider how things were there just 2 or 3 years ago, it's a huge bite out of the unofficial sovereignty that the Kurds were enjoying. I mean, I could get on a plane here in Beirut, fly into Erbil or Suleimania airports without an Iraqi visa in the past, and they even gave me a Kurdistan residence permit. Well, that's not going to happen anymore. You have Iraqi officials in charge of all the arrangements at these airports. So there and in other places like Kirkuk, which had been quietly taken over by the Kurds after the Iraqi army fled in the face of the IS advance in 2014, they've lost out hugely. They've lost a large proportion of the not just autonomy but the quasi-sovereignty that they had enjoyed.
And what about the economic impact? They've had nearly 6 months, basically, of this, as it were, blockade.
Yes, well, the economy was already in very dire straits, and even more so now. Plus, there's a row going on with the Baghdad government over what should be the Iraqi Kurds' share of Iraqi oil revenues. But I think perhaps the dire economic situation that Iraqi Kurdistan faced may well have been one of the reasons why President Barzani, as he then was, took that drastic decision to hold the independence referendum as a way of kind of focusing the Kurds' fears and anxieties outwards onto a kind of issue that they could all supposedly agree on.
It does seem then as though it's a series of setbacks for the Kurds on all these different fronts we're discussing. Is it fair to say we're a lot further now from the likelihood of an independent Kurdish state?
Well, I think in both cases, the Syrian and Iraqi case, Kurds had perhaps cautiously hoped that the huge degree of autonomy that the Iraqi Kurds already enjoyed. They have their own parliament, president, security forces, etc., their own flag flying over their public buildings, could be emulated by Syrian Kurdistan, emerging from the chaos of the civil war there, and that they might somehow merge into one kind of core Kurdish state and perhaps even inspire Turkish and Iranian Kurds to join in. Well, that dream, I think, is pretty much shattered. It's not going to happen in Syrian Kurdistan. The Turks are moving in on Afrin, which is a largely Kurdish area, and preparing to clip the Kurds' wings, if not doing something even more drastic, in the other Kurdish areas adjacent to the Turkish border. So the idea of an independent state emerging there is really not on the cards. And in fact, the Syrian Kurds have been quite realistic. They never set their eyes on statehood. They were talking about self-administration within a federal Syria. Equally in Iraqi Kurdistan, I think that is now really off the boil. I mean, the Iraqi Kurds did vote for independence, but that vote has actually ironically taken them a big step backwards away from it.
Jim Muir. It's been a busy week for India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi, and he spent much of it at the side of the visiting French President Emmanuel Macron. The two leaders began his trip with a bear hug, then announced a whole series of deals. The warmth grew as 20 African leaders joined them for a meeting of a new international alliance on solar power. For India, it's a Robin Hood policy. Take money from the rich, including France, and give it to poorer nations to develop solar power. So what's behind the Indian move? A passion for renewables and fair play, or something more? A question I put to Victor Mallet, the Asian news editor of the Financial Times.
There's been a lot of investment in solar power stations in India under the Modi government since 2014, and it's really becoming one of the biggest destinations for investors, both foreign and Indian, in solar electricity generation, partly because it's simply cheaper to generate electricity in this way, or it's becoming cheaper than it is through traditional means. And one of the advantages for India of this is that it helps to reduce the air pollution problem that's very, very pervasive across North India.
India, of course, has this great hunger for energy. I mean, Mr. Modi is talking about this promise to try and electrify every village across the country and so on, which is a massive promise. How far can solar energy really help them meet that? I mean, I know it's increased dramatically in the year since he came to office, but from a very low base.
Absolutely. I mean, it's still a relatively small proportion. But if you look at renewable energy as a whole, it has actually crept up as a share of the mix. You have got hydropower, you have got wind power as well. So it is small, but it is growing very fast. There's a lot of investment opportunities. And the point is that it doesn't really need to be heavily subsidized at the moment. The panels are cheap, the power is free, and there's a lot of land that is not very fertile in desert areas where actually it makes very good sense to have solar farms rather than any other kind of farms.
You say that the solar panels are cheap. They're going to be a lot more expensive, of course, if the government has its way. They're talking about 70% tariffs on imports, mostly from China. How much is this about really getting back at China, which seems to be dominating the industry?
In this case, it's not so much about getting back at China. It's more about trying to promote local industry. India is heavily dependent on imports from China of many things. So this is really about protecting local industry and trying to promote the local production of things like solar panels, which is actually not very extensive. And one of the problems with these 70% tariffs is that actually the Indian producers are not capable of producing the quantities required at any price at the moment. That's why India and indeed other countries are very heavily dependent on Chinese production. And China, by overinvesting in the solar panel business, has actually made solar power stations economical around the world, everywhere from Europe to India.
How much is China then part of this international alliance on solar energy, given its dominance? It does seem as though India is slightly trying to take the centre ground on this and keep China in the margins.
India has tried to put itself forward as a leading player. The problem is that because it's industrially not nearly as advanced as China, because it hasn't installed nearly as much alternative energy as China, it does find itself in a position where it's talking more than it's doing. But that's not because it isn't in the process of doing a lot of installation. But there's no doubt that, it wants to develop its own industry. It does see China as a very strong economic competitor, as well as a supplier to India. And it sees it as a very serious strategic competitor, which is one of the concerns and one of the reasons why India is very keen to have good relations with Macron and with Trump and with other democracies and other countries such as Japan and Australia. Well, we shouldn't forget that as well as doing a solar deal with Macron, there was also a defence deal that was done.
Absolutely, focusing very much on the Indian Ocean. And it does seem as though in terms of maritime security and indeed routes, India is really playing catch-up. It seems quite outmanoeuvred by China, even in its own backyard. Bangladesh, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, the Maldives, all areas where China seems to be investing heavily in port and other infrastructure and saying, and by the way, we will use them.
Absolutely. And China's also deploying, the Belt and Road Initiative, essentially massive investment in infrastructure in almost all of these countries that you mentioned. And India sees that partly as an advantage because India is one of the borrowers from the Asian Infrastructure Bank that the Chinese have set up. But it is also extremely worried about being encircled, as it were, by new economically dependent allies of China, like the Maldives, like Sri Lanka, and so on. Modi, don't forget, has very good relations with Abe, the nationalist Japanese prime minister. He has very good relations, relatively good relations with Trump. But the Indians are very keen to have friends who are not necessarily inimical to China, but who are willing to present a common front and stand up against China, whether it's strategically or economically. And the sort of three countries, along with India, Japan, Australia, and the US, they form this thing called the Quad, which doesn't have much form as yet, but it is a kind of proto-strategic alliance between four democracies in the Asia-Pacific. And the Indians are quite keen on that. The Americans, Trump has started talking about the Indo-Pacific. Instead of talking about the Asia-Pacific, he talks about the Indo-Pacific, which is America's kind of nod to the importance of India as a counter to Chinese influence.
I can totally see why Mr. Modi would be keen to be part of that sort of counterbalancing initiative. But how far do you think it will really go? I mean, how much would those other countries, for example, be willing to risk missing out on China's emerging market and influence?
That's a very reasonable question, especially with a country like France. I think with America, it seems that Trump is quite prepared to confront China, certainly on trade issues and indeed on strategic issues. With a sort of relatively weaker country such as the UK or France, those countries are likely to be slightly less eager certainly to offend China.
Victor Mallard. That's it from The World This Week for now. If you've got any thoughts on what we've done or on what you'd like us to do, please contact us at BBC World Service via Facebook or Twitter. And don't forget to join Sean Lay at the same time next week for a look back at what's happened in the next 7 days.
Join our podcasts, PLB Professional Languages Brazil. WhatsApp number 5586 99970 5812.